Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Sheviit. We're up to Perik Hey Mishnah Gimel. Today's Mishnah should be Leilu Nishmat Nere Ben Tzvelan Aranbai Menuchato Begen Eden Amen. Rabotai is an introduction. We spoke about earlier the loof plant. If you remember, the Rav says it's a type of onion. Rashi says it's a type of bean. But in any event, the roots of the loof plant are able to live for a long time, which means it's able to, the leaves are able to continue growing from one year to the next. So today's Mishnah is going to deal with a loof plant that produced leaves on Shemitah, and they grew further into the 8th year, meaning you have in the 8th year, you have leaves that are a mixture of 7th year growth which have Shemitah sanctity, and 8th year growth which do not have Shemitah sanctity. So the Mishnah says, Luf Avra Alav Sheviit. If a loof grew past Sheviit, meaning it produced leaves on Shemitah, and they continue growing into the 8th year, Rabbi Eliezer says, Im laktu anim et alav laktu. The law is like this. If the poor people picked all its leaves during Shemitah, they picked them, meaning all the leaves are theirs. Since they picked all the Shemitah growths themselves, the owner doesn't have to give them any. Vim lav. But if the poor did not pick all the leaves during Shemitah, the owner has to make an accounting with the poor. What does that mean? He has to make an accounting what proportion of the remaining leaves grew during Shemitah and give that proportion to them. We're going to explain after we read the next opinion what's going on here. Rabbi Yoshua disagrees. Rabbi Yoshua says, Im laktu anim et alav laktu. If the poor picked all the leaves during Shemitah, they picked all of them, meaning all the leaves are theirs. But if they didn't pick it during Shemitah, the poor people have no accounting with the owner, meaning the poor people only have a right to what they actually picked during Shemitah. They do not have a right to anything that they did not pick, even though some of the leaves that are growing, some portion of leaves that are growing on the plant have Shemitah sanctity. The owner doesn't have to give any of it to the poor. What is going on here? The Rab explains to us, and the art scroll expounds on it and elucidated, that you have to understand another concept to understand this Mishnah. It's what we call the laws of Bi'ul, literally means to destroy. But it's like this. A person can only pick limited amounts of produce on Shemitah and keep them in his house for use of himself and his family, as long as that type of produce can still be found in the field for animals, for wild animals to eat. Once the species of what you brought into your house is no longer available outside for wild animals to eat, you cannot keep any of that species in your house anymore. You have to perform the process of bi'ul, which is you give up the right of ownership in the produce and you put it outside your house for anyone to take. The Rav quotes a disagreement later on in chapter 9, Mishnah 8, amongst the Tanaim, about who can take Shemitah produce after it's bi'ul, after the owner put it outside and declared it ownerless. Rabbi Yehuda says that it can be taken only by the poor, while Rabbi Yossi says it can be taken by anybody, even the owner himself. The owner calls it ownerless, puts it outside, and takes it back himself, according to Rabbi Yossi. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says that only the poor can take it. That's in contrast to the Shemitah produce, which is available to everybody, rich and poor. So now, plugging their disagreement into our Mishnah, it's like this. The first time of our Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer. He agrees with Rabbi Yeshua's opinion that only the poor can take the produce after bi'ul, after this declaration of not owning it anymore, whereas the original owner cannot take it. So the leaves that grew on the loof plant during Shemitah and they became subject to the laws of bi'ul, they belong entirely to the poor and no one else. So the owner is only entitled to that which grew during the 8th year. So the owner has to calculate the proportion of the leaves currently on the plant that grew on Shemitah, as opposed to the proportion that grew in the 8th year, and give the Shemitah proportion to the poor while he keeps the rest. That's what the Rab said. That's what the Mishnah said. Im lav, if the poor did not pick all the leaves during Shemitah, yaseh cheshbonim anim. You have to make an accounting with the poor, what proportion of Shemitah leaves is in the plant, and give that to them, because the bi'ul can only be taken by the poor. The next Tana, which is Rabbi Yeshua, he agrees with Rabbi Yossi's opinion that even the owner himself can take back the produce after the bi'ul. So according to him, any leaves that the poor did not pick during Shemitah, they become the property of the owner, and therefore he doesn't have to give any to them. That's what the Mishnah says. Im lab, in Rabbi Yeshua's opinion, if they didn't pick it during Shemitah, and lanim alav cheshbon, the poor people have no accounting. They have no right to what they didn't pick. They can only pick what they took during Shemitah. Now the Tosfot Yom Tov explains that the loof plant, this onion or bean plant that we're discussing here, it was uprooted by the owner during Shemitah, before the time of bi'ul. He was allowed to take it, and he brought it into his house. Then when the bi'ul deadline arrived, that he had to take it out of his house and declare it ownerless, he removed it from his house and put it outside for anyone to take, like he's obligated to do. The luf took root again when it was left outside, and it restarted growing leaves in the 8th year. So Rabbi Eliezer holds that whatever grew during Shemitah, even that which the poor people didn't pick, they become the property of the poor when the biur is done, whereas Rabbi Yeshua says that the owner can take it for himself. Now, regarding vegetables, the question of whether they are Shemitah produce or not is determined by the year in which they were picked. In our case, since the plant was uprooted on Shemitah, it has Shemitah sanctity. It's considered Shemitah produce, even though it was replanted and then uprooted again in the 8th year. That, and the Rab tells us, halakha is Rabbi Yeshua, the halakha does follow Rabbi Yeshua, that whatever leaves the poor pick during Shemitah is theirs, but whatever they do not pick, they have no accounting with the owner can keep it. He doesn't have to make a calculation of what proportion of Shemitah leaves is still growing in the 8th year. You can keep whatever they didn't take. Simple as that. That is then Rabotai of Mishnah Gimel. Mishnah Daled is going to deal with the laws of luf, again this onion or bean plant and other similar plants that finished growing in the 6th year, but they remained in the ground until the 7th. What does that mean? Chazon Ish, brought down by the Lucid Art Scroll, he explains that generally we define a vegetable that it belongs to the year in which it was picked. But this rule only applies where it also grew a little bit in that year. If it completely finished growing the year before and it didn't grow at all in the year it was picked, it has the status of the year in which it was picked. That's what the Rash tells us. In our Mishnah's case, the luf and the other vegetables are not Shemitah produce, even though they were dug up during Shemitah, because their entire growth took place in the 6th year. So, since it took place in the 6th year and it was only uprooted in the 7th, because it remained in the ground in the 7th, we go by the year in which it was planted, in which most of its growth took place. So, basically what happened is, in order to obtain the root of the plant, which was edible, person would have to dig into the ground. The Chachamim, the sages, were concerned that somebody would dig up these plants on Shemitah. He gives off the impression that he's working the land, because when you dig into the land, you're softening the soil, which makes it better for planting, right? So the Chachamim decreed that a person is forbidden to dig up luf and similar plants on Shemitah, except if he does it in an unusual way. So the Mishnah says, Luf shel erev Sheviit shenichnas Sheviit. Luf that completed its growth in the 6th year, but it was still rooted in the ground when Shemitah began. V'chen b'tzadim hakitzonim, as well as summer onions. The Mefarshim explain that summer onions is a type of onion that's planted in the early summer and picked in the summer. But obviously our Mishnah is referring to luf that was left in the ground until the following year. V'chen puash shel idit, also madder growing in fertile soil. A madder is a type of herb that they would get red dye from. They would use it to produce red dye. So the Mishnah is specifically saying that it's growing in fertile soil, because later on it's going to give a different halakha regarding matter growing in rocky ground. So we have to distinguish it. Now, the Mishnah is referring to summer onions and the matter that grew completely in the 6th year, and they were dug up during Shemitah, like the luf that we mentioned. Bet Shammai Amrim, Bet Shammai says, Okrin oto b'ma'arufot shel etz, a person can uproot them during Shemitah only with wooden spades. He is not allowed to use metal spades that are ordinarily used for this purpose, because that would appear like he's working the land. So to avoid giving this impression, person has to deviate from the normal practice and he has to use a wooden spade instead. Whereas Bet Hillel disagree and they say, Bekaldumot shel matachot, a person can uproot these plants even with metal mattocks, which is a type of pickaxe. And the Mefarshim explain that this mattocks has 2 blades, one that's broad and one that's pointed. The broad blade was used by woodcutters for chopping doon trees, and the pointed blade was used for splitting wood into smaller pieces. The Rab explains this definition in Mishnah Kelim, chapter 13, Mishnah 3, in Mishnah Kelim. Nevertheless, even though Bet Hillel allow a person to uproot it with this metal mattocks, the reason they require this is because they require a small change from the ordinary method. Therefore, they only allow this mattock of metal and not a spade of metal. Now, the Mishnah here is specifically, the Rab does point this out, it's specifically referring to plants that grew entirely in the 6th year. If they would have continued growing into the 7th year, they would have become Shemitah produce. A person would not be allowed to dig it up at all. Why? Because digging up these plants in an unusual manner will damage them, and you're not allowed to damage Shemitah produce. Like we said earlier, you can get Shemitah produce to eat, but not to waste. And the Mishnah now is going to conclude by citing a case where Bet Shammai agree with Bet Hillel, umodim bepuah shel tzlaot. Bet Shammai agree in the case of matter growing in rocky ground, that a person can uproot it even with metal mattocks, because since rocky ground is not usually planted, people will not think that the farmer is working the land. Therefore, all of them will agree that the mattock of metal is permitted. But even in this case, a metal spade is assumed, because again, maybe the Chachamim made a low plug, they didn't distinguish. But even Bet Shammai would agree with Bet Hillel that you're allowed to use this metal mattock, you don't have to use a wooden spade. That is then Rabotai today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.